The Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan was situated on an island in a lake. It could hardly be a coincidence that Tenochtitlan was almost a replica of the capital of Atlantis, which Plato describes in the Critias. Andrew Thomas. It's no coincidence, and it's no replica. Tenochtitlan is the city of Atlantis. Plato clearly stated the city of Atlantis was located on a small island that only measured 5 states in diameter, and the royal palace was located in the city. The island city of Tenochtitlan stands up very well to Plato's criteria for Atlantis. The diameter of Tenochtitlan at the time of the Spanish conquest is estimated at varying lengths by various sources. None are in agreement. All modern estimates for the diameter of Tenochtitlan are slightly larger than Atlantis, and all are within reason for Atlantis when population growth and landfill expansion for the Aztec capital are taken into account over 1900 years, the time that elapsed between Plato and the Spanish conquest. An interesting estimation for the diameter of Tenochtitlan comes from A.P. Maudslay, the English translator of the discovery and conquest of Mexico. A.P. Maudslay's estimation for Tenochtitlan's diameter is based on Cortez's retreat from the city during an incident known in Spanish history as the Noche Triste, translated as Sad Night in English. The event took place on the evening of June 30th, 1520. During the sad night, Cortez and the conquistadors had to fight their way out of Tenochtitlan following the death of the Aztec Emperor Montezuma. A.P. Maudslay calculated the distance of the Spanish retreat in 3 measurements. Beginning at the Spaniards' lodging near Montezuma's palace and the city's epicenter, the conquistadors retreated an estimated 1,000 yards to the Tecpanzingo Bridge. From there, the Spaniards retreated an estimated 740 yards to the bridge at Tolteacalli. From Tolteacalli, Cortez and his men finally reached the Tacuba Causeway at the edge of the island. They traveled an estimated 500 yards during the final leg of the retreat. In all, the Spanish retreated an estimated 1¼ miles. The 1¼ mile Spanish retreat represents the island city's radius. The diameter of the city, therefore, is twice its radius, or approximately 2½ miles. Tenochtitlan was 5 times larger than Atlantis at the time of the Spanish conquest. The Spanish conquistadors said much of Tenochtitlan was built directly into Lake Texcoco, beyond the limits of the island's natural shoreline, through a series of landfill expansions. Because of this, it's uncertain what the diameter of Tenochtitlan's natural island shoreline was at the time of the Spanish conquest. There are no surviving pre-conquest Aztec records that can help shed light on the mystery. What is certain is that over time, the Aztecs greatly extended the natural boundaries of the island shoreline. Atlantis was half a mile in diameter in the 5th century BC. Tenochtitlan was 2½ miles in diameter at the time of the Spanish conquest 1900 years later. A growth rate from half a mile in the 5th century BC to 2½ miles in diameter 1900 years later is a reasonable expansion rate when the pressures of an increasing population and landfill extensions are taken into account. The diameter of Atlantis and the diameter of Tenochtitlan are close enough to each other to say that the same island is being described by Plato and the Spanish conquistadors. The key point to remember is that both islands were small, very small. Plato said some of the buildings in the city of Atlantis were white in color, while other buildings were a mixture of different colored stones. He also said the buildings of Atlantis filled the people with delight when gazed upon. Bernal Diaz del Castillo said the buildings of Tenochtitlan gleamed white, and they were pleasing to the eye, just like Atlantis. Bernal Diaz del Castillo never grew tired of describing the splendor and beauty of Tenochtitlan's monuments and buildings, or the pleasure they gave when gazed upon. Unfortunately, not a single Spanish conquistador mentions multicolored stone buildings in Tenochtitlan. They only mention white buildings in the Aztec capital. The gaps left by the Spanish conquistadors are more than made up for by modern archaeology and photography. Modern archaeology confirms that many pre-conquest buildings in the Valley of Mexico were made of multicolored stone, and many of the multicolored stone buildings were given a thick coat of white plaster. Modern archaeology also confirms that many of the plastered buildings were painted, sometimes in multiple colors, usually red, blue, yellow, or combinations of the three. The multicolored stonework of Atlantis came in two forms in pre-conquest Mexico: as buildings actually made of multicolored stone, and as plastered buildings given a coat of decorative paint. Tenochtitlan, like Atlantis, had white and multicolored buildings. Plato said the people of Atlantis built temples, palaces, harbors, and docks in and around the city. This isn't an earth-shattering revelation pointing to a unique and undeniable connection between Tenochtitlan and Atlantis. In fact, it's rather generic information that can be applied to any large metropolitan coastal city of the ancient world. However, Plato's observation about Atlantis applies in whole to Tenochtitlan, therefore it is a match. There were many temples in pre-conquest Mexico dedicated to many gods. The Aztecs worshipped a pantheon of deities, and each had its own sanctuary temple where it was worshipped. The number of temples and the size of a deity's temple were directly proportional to the importance of the deity in Aztec society. Plato said the palace of the king was located in the city of Atlantis. The most famous palace in Mexico at the time of the Spanish conquest belonged to the Aztec Emperor Montezuma. Located at the epicenter of Tenochtitlan, it was large and it was lavish. Abundant gold and abundant Aztec cuisine were most often written about while Cortes and the conquistadors were guests of Montezuma. Plato said Atlantis had harbors and docks. Unfortunately, the conquistadors are silent about docks and harbors in the city of Tenochtitlan, but they noted canoe traffic on the lakes was sometimes heavy. Modern historians, on the other hand, indicate a large docking facility and harbor were located at the northwestern end of the island. Like Atlantis, Tenochtitlan was home to temples, a palace, a large harbor, and docking facility. Plato said the people of Atlantis built a special temple in the capital city. Called the Temple of Poseidon, it was an imposing structure of imposing dimensions. It measured 607 feet long by 300 feet wide, and Plato described it as outlandish in appearance. Unfortunately, Plato failed to write down the temple's height, and failed to write down what type of structure the temple was. In size and grandeur, the Temple of Poseidon at Atlantis easily compares to the great monumental structures of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. To put the Temple of Poseidon into perspective, the Great Pyramid of Giza measures 756 by 756 by 481 feet in length, width, and height. The Temple of Poseidon had an oblong base roughly half the size of the Great Pyramid of Egypt. That's a big temple. The measurements for the Temple of Poseidon suggest it was a large megalithic structure such as a pyramid or ziggurat, not a large megalithic building such as the Greek Parthenon, which only measures 228 by 101 feet, roughly a third the size of the Temple of Poseidon. Pre-conquest Mexico had pyramids and ziggurats. They were intricate, ornate, and functional. Mexican pyramids were built with staircases leading to summits and ornamented with imposing creatures. Mesoamerican ziggurats were often a mingling of pyramids, buildings, and plazas arranged in a three-dimensional meshing of eye-pleasing architectural complexity that defied conventional engineering sensibilities. They were outlandish in appearance, just as Plato said about Atlantis. Most importantly, some Mesoamerican pyramids had temples and altars at their summit, making them large temple structures such as Plato described for Atlantis. In Tenochtitlan stood twin temples high atop a flattened pyramid base. Called Teocalli by the Aztecs, it was the most prominent structure in the city. The two temples that rose from the top of the base pyramid were called the Temple of Huitzilopochtli and the Temple of Tlaloc. After the conquest, the Spanish renamed Teocalli the Templo Mayor and completely destroyed it. Very little of it survived in modern times. Unfortunately, the Spanish conquistadors failed to record the measurements of the Templo Mayor base pyramid before tearing it down, so we are only left with crude modern guesstimates of its dimensions. Equally unfortunate is the fact that there is no agreement on the dimensions of the Templo Mayor base pyramid. Modern guesstimates for the Templo Mayor base pyramid range from 328 by 262 feet at the low end to 1200 by 1200 feet at the high end. One guesstimate places the height of the base pyramid at 180 feet. Although there is no close or exact guesstimate for the dimensions of the Templo Mayor pyramid, the guesstimates we do have fall within range of Plato's measurements for the Temple of Poseidon at Atlantis. The Temple of Poseidon at Atlantis and Tenochtitlan's Templo Mayor have things in common. Both were massive monumental structures dedicated to large national deities. Both share common physical characteristics, namely temples. Both were built in the capital city. In that respect, the Templo Mayor fulfills Plato's criteria for the Temple of Poseidon at Atlantis. Plato said the Temple of Poseidon had an altar of superior workmanship. While a guest of Montezuma, Cortes and some of his men were escorted to the top of the Templo Mayor and taken inside the Temple of Huitzilopochtli. The Spanish conquistadors wrote the altar inside the Temple of Huitzilopochtli was used to perform the grisly act of human sacrifice. Bernal Diaz del Castillo described the altar inside the Temple of Huitzilopochtli in vivid detail. He said the workmanship was superb and superior, just as Plato said about the altar in the Temple of Poseidon. Bernal Diaz del Castillo also said the altar of Huitzilopochtli was ornate. It was carved with bizarre and wondrous creatures that were encrusted with precious stones, silver, and gold. The Spanish conquistador also said the altar of Huitzilopochtli was splattered with a thick accumulation of coagulated human blood. He said the temple interior was filled with a vile stench. Gruesome functionality aside, the altar inside the Temple of Huitzilopochtli was crafted with superior workmanship, just like Atlantis. Plato called the Temple of Atlantis the Temple of Poseidon. Why would Plato give the name of a Greek god to a foreign country with a foreign language that in all likelihood worshipped foreign gods not named Poseidon? Plato explains why. The Greek philosopher said the people, places, and things of Atlantis had names that were so strange and so unfamiliar sounding, he needed to give them names his Greek audience would be familiar and comfortable with. So he gave them Greek names. Plato named Poseidon the patron deity of the Temple of Atlantis. The Aztecs named Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc the patron deities of the Templo Mayor. Poseidon is the Greek god of the sea. Tlaloc is the Aztec god of rain. Both Poseidon and Tlaloc are gods of water, large bodies of water. Poseidon is the god of water on earth below. Tlaloc is the god of water in heaven above. In a strange twist, a writer made this observation, quote, the name Tlaloc, the Aztec rain and water god, has been compared with the Greek word for sea, thalassa, not only for the sound of the name, but for the element which he rules." Unquote. And, even stranger, the Aztec word for the Templo Mayor, Teocalli, contains an easily recognizable compound Greek word, Teocalli, whose literal English translation is God House, or House of God. These subtle hints of contact between ancient Greece and Mesoamerica suggests the Greek story of Atlantis is the story of an actual city located on the American continent. It also suggests that Mesoamerica was visited by ancient Greek mariners who brought the story of their journey back to Greece, where it eventually became Plato's Atlantis. Is Poseidon the closest thing the Greeks had to Thalak? Is Thalak Plato's Poseidon of Atlantis? Plato said Poseidon bestowed the island city of Atlantis with godlike lavishness. When the Spanish conquistadors first gazed upon Tenochtitlan, they were mesmerized by what they saw. Both Cortes and Bernal Diaz del Castillo described Tenochtitlan as the most beautiful city in the world. Always astounded by the breathtaking scenery the city had to offer, the Spaniards frequently commented on the floral lavishness of Tenochtitlan. During their stay in Tenochtitlan, the conquistadors were given lavish feasts and banquets. The lodging accommodations given to Cortes and his men while a guest of Montezuma were lavish, and they never failed to comment on the lavish objects of gold continually heaped upon them by the Aztecs. By all accounts of the Spanish conquistadors, everything about pre-conquest Tenochtitlan was lavish, just like Atlantis. The city of Atlantis had some very unique features. Plato said there were two springs that supplied the city with all its water needs. One spring produced cold water, the other hot. The water from the springs was quite good, and the outpour was made available in the city from various buildings. Plato also said the water from the springs was carried by aqueduct to outer islands via city bridges leading on and off the island. Lake Texcoco, the body of water surrounding Tenochtitlan, was salty, and the water was unfit for drinking. Because of this, Tenochtitlan was forced to seek alternative sources for drinking water. With approximately 500,000 residents living in the city at the time of the Spanish conquest, plus tens of thousands of visitors who came and went from the city on a daily basis, the task of supplying fresh drinking water to the Aztec capital was a daunting one. The Aztecs were up to the challenge, and they devised an ingenious solution to Tenochtitlan's freshwater dilemma long before the arrival of the Spanish in the 16th century. The Aztecs constructed a 3-mile-long aqueduct from the city to a spring on the mainland near the city of Chapultepec. As the population of Tenochtitlan increased, the Aztecs were forced to build a second aqueduct to a second spring on the mainland near the city of Coyoacan. This matches Plato's criteria. Both Atlantis and Tenochtitlan were supplied with drinking water from two springs. The water in the Coyoacan aqueduct was carried to Tenochtitlan via the Iztapalapa Causeway. This exactly matches Plato's criteria for spring water being carried by aqueduct across a bridge in the city of Atlantis.